Hi, welcome to Real Estate Resource. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and check back every week for new videos. Enjoy this one. Here we go. So, today we are going to talk about the buyer representation agreement. There's a couple reasons this came up. I've been asked a couple times recently how a buyer could pay a commission if the seller wasn't going to, if the listing agent or the seller were, let's say, off market and weren't offering compensation. This is a way that the buyer can pay that compensation. Also, it is basically an employment contract, a listing agreement, if you will, for your buyer, right? And I know that not a lot of us use these buyer representation agreements, and that becomes a business decision for each and every one of us that want to use it. And after today, you can really decide if this is something that you want to incorporate into your business. But what it is a listing agreement for a buyer, right? And when people ask me should they use it or shouldn't they, I usually use the analogy, well, if I called you and said I want to sell my house, and you said, great, I'm willing to list and sell for you, but I don't want you to sign a listing agreement. What I want to do is I promise you I will pay you a commission, and we can sign a commission agreement once you find a buyer. But you go out there and market it. You go find me a buyer, and I promise you, you're my agent. How many of you guys would take that seller on without a listing agreement signed, right? Some might, but most of us, the majority, 99.9% of us, are not going to work a listing without having that commitment from the seller. But every day we work buyers with zero commitment, right? We just have them say, yeah, I want you to be my agent. And then those buyers, go out and do their own thing. And ultimately maybe we lose them, maybe we don't. They're loyal to us, they aren't. So I'm not saying that this is something that you have to have, but it's something that you should know about to decide if this is something that you want to incorporate into your business model and working with your buyers, okay? So let's share my screen. And all right, so you guys should be looking at the disclosure regarding agency relationships right now, okay? That is also the chat that is going to come with it, just like it does with a listing agreement, just like it comes with a purchase agreement. So let's talk about first how we introduce this buyer representation agreement. Number one, when you're setting your appointments for your buyer consultation, one of the conversations you should be having with your buyer is, by the way, when you come in for the consultation, if you decide that we are a good match, that I am the right agent for you, and I feel comfortable and confident that you and I can work together, I'm going to ask you to sign some paperwork. Okay, we should tell them up front. If they ask what it is, you can give them a little brief description of what it is. Well, it is going to be some disclosure paperwork that you have to sign, and then a contract between the two of us to work together. If you're going to use this, that's the right way to do it. If you're meeting people and then saying, yeah, let's meet, and I'm going to show you properties and do all that stuff, and then right after the end of the appointment, go, oh, by the way, I need you to sign this. It's a little bit like a bait and switch, right? I think that you should be forthcoming if you're going to use this. If you're going to use it and you make it part of your business model, then you use it with every buyer, okay? The thing is with this is it's really hard to enforce, right? So we'll get into those reasons why it's hard to enforce. So it ultimately, I think, becomes more of a moral contract with buyers than it does anything else. And so just let me know if you guys have any questions as we move on through this. Okay, so disclosure regarding agency relationships. We know what that one is. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I always like to have that refresher because I feel like, we still kind of dismiss it and its importance. This form is a disclosure on how a client can be represented by an agent. It is not a commitment to work with an agent. It is not a commitment between you and the buyer. It does not create a fiduciary duty to that client. It is just a disclosure, plain and simple. So I could have my buyer Gilbert sign this agency relationship, not sign a buyer representation agreement, and still go out and work with somebody else and not have any, he's not bound to me in any way. Okay, so you need to understand that. When you're having this discussion with buyers and sellers that need to sign this, this does not create a binding agreement. This document is just a disclosure, how you can be represented by an agent. Number one, as a seller's agent, right? I list your property, I sell your house for you, I am a seller's agent. As a buyer's agent, I find you, we work together, we go look at properties, I am representing you as a buyer's agent. And then there's finally that agent representing both buyer and seller. That establishes dual agency, and I have to get your permission to act in that capacity as a dual agent, right? That's the three ways, plain and simple. Have them sign it, you sign it, you hold on to your file. Like, that's it. Once, if I do this on a buyer on a buyer presentation, right, where I have them come in, do the consultation, have them sign paperwork. If I do this, I don't need to do another one of these with the offer, right? So if we do end up writing offers, it comes up, I don't need to include that one because I have this one already signed. As long as the date that they sign it is prior to you submitting any offers, this agency disclosure is fine for anything you guys do in the future, right? You don't need to do a new one. I gotta turn off that sound. It drives me nuts when somebody comes in or leaves. All right, so that's agency disclosure. The next one is the fair housing. Again, that's just, there's no discrimination against people. You can't make a choice based on, race, creed, religion, sex, orientation, anything like that. Okay. Since we're talking about the fair housing, just know that you guys, I like to repeat it just in case, you guys should not be submitting with your offers those love letters, right? The letter from the client, the buyer, to the seller, explaining why they love the house so much and why they should live there and telling their life stories. Don't do that anymore. Unless the listing agent is asking for them, right? Because there's a spot in a listing agreement where it says the seller does not, the default, the seller is not going to receive those. There's a little box to check where they can approve getting those love letters, and most people aren't going to do that. Okay, so let's look at this. This is the buyer representation agreement exclusive. This should be the only one you use. The non-exclusive, I don't even know why it exists. The non-exclusive has nothing about compensation from the buyer to the broker. It's meaningless, so don't ever use it. It's always going to be buyer representation agreement exclusive, okay? So just like a listing agreement, if you look at it, exclusive right to represent. These are the buyers, Tom and John Smith. This is the broker, Century 21 All-Stars. It must have a begin date and an end date, just like a listing agreement does. If it does not have a begin date and it does not have an end date, or it has neither, this is an unenforceable contract. And that same thing goes for a listing agreement. If your listing agreement does not have a begin date or an end date, it is unenforceable, right? So that means it's worthless. So we have to have a begin date and an end date. Again, that number is going to be up to you. I would say probably 6 months at a minimum, knowing what it's like working with buyers at this point, right? Sometimes you get lucky and you get somebody that hits right away. Sometimes you have buyers, Gilbert, right, that you work with for 9 months before you get them into escrow. So you do work this accordingly, right? 6 months, a year, something like that, but it has to have a begin date and an end date. Okay, so that would be binding, just like a listing agreement. As long as I'm working with those people between these two time periods, anything that happens based on what this contract states, I'm owed compensation. Okay, so here we get into the property to be acquired, and this is the part that makes it hard to enforce. Because I can't write here where it says property to be acquired, any purchase, lease, or other acquisition of any real property or manufactured home described as the location. I can't just blanket write California, right? That's too vague to be enforceable. I can't say if they buy or sell or rent anything in California, I am owed compensation. But I also can't be too specific. Like in location, I can't just write one city. Because if I write just Downey in their buyer's representation agreement and they buy a house in Norwalk, guess what? This is unenforceable. I'm not owed any compensation. So we've got to kind of really suss it out and look at and say, okay, so in my buyer consultation, with the buyer, we're going to talk about all the areas they're willing to look at or are interested in looking at it, and where they can buy based on their buying power. And if it turns out that it's like, hey, it's around here, it's Norwalk, Downey, Pico, Whittier, like those are the 4 cities. Okay, then those are the 4 cities I'm going to put it in. Now, if it starts to change, if say we look at those 4 cities, we can't find anything, and they say, well, maybe I'm willing to go a little farther east or whatever, like I'm willing to go to Inland Empire, let's start looking out there. There's a form that's called Modification of Listing and / Buyer Representation Agreement. I can then fill out that form, which is a modification to this contract, and I can put the new cities they're interested in. As this can be a working document, okay? The problem is most of the time it doesn't work that way for us as agents. We take the shortcut. We don't use all the tools that are available to us, so it doesn't become a working document. It just becomes this one piece of evidence. And so that's where the enforceability becomes difficult, because I don't let the form grow with the buyers and my relationship. And so when the areas grow or change, or their pricing changes, comes down or goes up, I don't make those adjustments. Then they go and find something else on their own that is just outside those parameters. I can't enforce the contract. So know that you could always kind of make adjustments to it. It's called Modification of Listing or Buyer Representation Agreement. No, you can't just write blanket a county either. It's got to be specific enough that you could say, look, this is the conversations I've had with them. So what we're trying to avoid is that you're locking somebody into a contract without really doing your job. Because if I just put LA County, Orange County, San Bernardino County, I put all the way to those counties, well, did I really have a conversation with the buyer? Because is there any buyer that's really open to all 3 counties? And if I talk to a buyer and find out what they're looking for, they're not looking at all of LA County, because all of LA County is, what's up north, what's that, like Pomona, and you got all these areas all the way down to, before you get to the Orange County border. It's a big area, LA County. Not every buyer is looking at every area of LA County. So we do have to be specific if we want this to be enforceable. We just have to make sure that we're covering all our bases, and that's why you make this thing a living document by using that modification form, that when it changes from the Downey, Southgate, Pico, Norwalk first, where then it starts to expand to other cities, then I can add those cities as we move on, as we start looking, as things change, as our conversations happen, where I show proof that I'm working with the agent, okay? Any other property that I could, like things I could describe, like maybe some of the features of the home, right? If your buyer's looking for a 3-bedroom, have there been buyers that you've spoken to that have said, hey, I have to have a 3-bedroom, but they ultimately end up buying a 2, right? So I can cover myself, and that's acceptable to say, property features could be, 2-bedroom, 1 bath to 4-bedroom, 2 bath, 3 bedrooms to 4 bedrooms, may or may not have a pool. Like I can start to put some property features in these things also. And then the price range. The price range has to make sense also. It can't be 0 to $1 million. If my buyer's qualified for $600,000, we're probably buying something between, $500,000 and $625,000, right? Those are our price points. So keep it realistic to what the buyer's buying power is. Don't go 0 to $1 million. Well, your buyer's not buying $1 million house, and there's nothing for 0. Okay, so let's be realistic and have our price range work with what our buyer is actually able to buy. What we're trying to do is we're trying to create a document that is more enforceable, right? That says, hey, listen, I did all of what I was supposed to do, and we'll talk about that. And the buyer still went out and bought, and they bought within the parameters of this contract. They owe me compensation. Okay, so what this is trying to do is stop your buyers from running out and writing an offer with the listing agent, or getting caught up with another agent when you're doing your job. I mean, you have to do your job in order to use this. Now, earlier I said the reason I want to talk about this is because I've had people ask me, how do I have the buyer pay the compensation if the seller is not, right? Like it's an off-market thing. The seller is not going to pay any of the commission. Let's say it's even a for sale by owner that the seller doesn't want to pay the commission. but your buyer wants it and they want your protection. They want you to represent them. What you could do is, if it is one property, I could check this box and write the specific address. I don't have to worry about all this other stuff at the top, just this specific address right here, because that's only for me representing you on that property that you're going to pay me compensation. Or if it were, let's say, 3 or 4 properties they were deciding between that had kind of in the same issue where the buyer was going to be the one paying the commission, I could check this box off and I could attach a list, which is an addendum. On the addendum, I could list all the properties that they're interested in, and if they buy those properties, I'm owed compensation. Okay, I could get that specific to a specific property. Questions? Anybody questions? All right, let's move on. Broker agrees to exercise due diligence and reasonable efforts to fulfill the following authorizations and obligations. Broker will perform its obligations under this agreement through the individual signing for broker below or another real estate licensee is signed by broker. So what's happening is that just like your listing agreement, the brokerage owns your buyer with this one, right? So if something were to go south between an agent that worked here and the buyer, we could still hold on to the buyer and assign them to another agent instead of letting them move on based on what's in this contract. Generally not going to do that, but it's possible that someone else under the brokerage could continue the broker's duties for that buyer if the buyer's agent and the buyer had some kind of falling out. This talks about the agency relationship disclosure that we just talked about and the possible dual agency that's there. So we don't need to go into that. This part right here, this single agency only. So you're going to kind of avoid these 2 ors in paragraph 2C. The first one says single agency only, right? If you check it off, it says, buyer understands that this election will prevent broker from showing buyer those properties that are listed with the broker's firm or from representing buyer in connection with those properties. Buyer's acquisition of a property listed with broker's firm shall not affect broker's right to be compensated under paragraph 3. So don't check that off because we do list properties. We list properties for sale, but we're not just representing them. We want to have the ability to do a dual agency so that we can show them our listings. And the second one is just saying that our brokerage does not list properties at all. So it doesn't matter. We're just representing them as buyers. So you're going to stay away from these 2 ors right here on paragraph 2C, possible dual agency. You're going to leave these alone. Leave it to default as that we could act as dual agents based on the permission from the possible representation of more than one buyer-seller form that we'll sign with the offer. Okay? Just like in the PRBS, it says on here that there may be other potential buyers that the broker is working with, and there is no confidentiality of offers. Buyers advise that seller or listing agent may disclose the existence, terms, or conditions of buyer's offer unless all parties and their agents have signed a written confidentiality agreement. Whether any such information is actually disclosed depends on many factors, such as current market conditions, the prevailing practice in the real estate community, the listing agent's marketing strategy, and the instructions of the seller. So, again, it's just reinforcing that your offer is not necessarily confidential. Okay, so that it mentions that in the PRBS, but it also mentions here in the buyer representation agreement. Now, this is where we're going to talk about the compensation to the broker. Okay, the amount of real estate compensation, just like in a listing agreement, they have this in bold. The amount of real estate commissions is not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiable between buyer and broker. Real estate commissions include all compensation and fees to broker. Buyer agrees to pay broker irrespective of agency relationships as follows. So, just like the listing agreement says the exact same thing, that they have to pay us no matter who represents the buyer in the listing agreement. In this case, it doesn't matter if we write an offer on one of our own listings or somebody else's, you're going to owe us compensation if you buy a property that matches any of those criteria that we did up here. Right? Whether it's a specific property, it's properties on a list, or it's this description of the properties that we're looking for. If you buy anything, buyer, you're going to owe us this compensation that we're going to write in here. So this is why it goes into that case of if I'm a buyer and I'm going to pay your commission because the seller is not paying one off market, this is where we're going to negotiate and show what the payment is. Yes, Jesus, you have your hand up.
Hi, Kyle. I know you mentioned this is like when the seller is not paying commission. What if I get a buyer that is not able to get a house within a year, year and a half, and they say, Jesus, I'm dumping my agent. If you give me a house, I'll pay you so much. I'll give you 1%. I'll give you 10,000. Can we use it as well?
Yeah, technically, sure, you could. And I'll tell as we go farther in, you'll get to see how it describes the payment of the compensation from the buyer. But yeah, yes, you could do that too.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so you guys are going to figure out, is it 2%, is it 3%, is it 1.5%? It's whatever you guys are going to go negotiate. Now, if your buyer's paying the compensation on this because you're not getting anything else paid, you're not getting paid by anybody else, you may want to, in this and, if you're going to charge them for the TC fee, this is where you would write the $275 transaction coordinator commission in this and section. So you would check off the box, put 3%, 2%, 1.5% in here of the acquisition price, and the 275 for the transaction coordinator commission. Okay. If it was a flat rate, right? If they just say, hey, they're going to pay me $10,000 to represent them on the property, then you would check off the box here. Flat rate would go there. Okay. This one, you can have a compensation schedule that's as an attached addendum. So you could say if the sales price is X, then I'm going to pay this. If, for example, when Jesus just brought up, is I could check this off and then we could write in there that says, hey, buyer is paying me an additional 1% commission on top of the commission that I'm earning from the seller. And that would be completely legal. And you could then submit this just like you do your listing agreement for proof of the commission to escrow. So you get a commission from the buyer, get a commission from the seller. You could do both. You just have to have this signed by the buyer. Okay. So this is how we decide what the amount of the compensation is. Okay. Questions about that part of it, the amount of the compensation. Okay. So moving on. Compensation payments and credits. The buyer is responsible for payment of compensation provided for in this agreement. However, if anyone other than the buyer compensates broker for services covered by this agreement, that amount shall be credited towards buyer's obligation to pay commission or compensation. If the amount of compensation broker receives from anyone other than the buyer exceeds the buyer's obligation, the excess amount shall be disclosed to the buyer and, if allowed by law, paid to the broker, which it is. We're not going to check the box off to credit to the buyer. That's not happening. So what it is saying is this. If I go and I say, hey, listen, you're going to pay me 2% to find you a house, right? That's what you're agreeing to. As long as we work together, at a minimum, I'm going to make 2%. And if you go buy with somebody else, you're going to still owe me the 2%, right? Because we'll get to how we get paid in a minute. But if, for example, I write an offer on somebody's listing and that listing pays me 2% or pays me 2.5%, then that money is basically washes away anything that's owed by the buyer. Now, if the buyer promised to pay me 3% to help represent them, and then my commission was 2%, technically they would still owe me the difference. We're not going to do that, right? We're not going to charge them the difference, obviously. So we need to, just to make them feel safe, we would put something in there that says, hey, seller, if buyer's compensation exceeds compensation paid by a third party, seller will, broker will not seek the difference or something of that nature, right? We'd have to put that in there to make them feel better. The broker right to compensation. So just like in the listing agreement, this is the ways that you get paid based on this agreement. The broker shall be entitled to the compensation provided for in paragraph 3A if during the representation period or any extension thereof, buyer enters into an agreement to acquire property described in paragraph 1A on terms acceptable to buyer, provided seller completes the transaction or is prevented to do so by buyer. Broker shall be entitled to compensation whether any escrow resulting from such agreement closes during or after the expiration of the representation period. Just like the listing agreement, right? If they buy something, the terms are agreeable, the compensation is owed. Now remember, if I get paid from the seller, it washes away that the buyer doesn't have to pay it. Okay. Number 2, if within blank calendar days, right? So just like the listing that I advise you guys to do 180 calendar days, that says that if the seller sells to anybody that's on the exemption list, they owe me. Well, it's the same thing. If I put 180 calendar days here, It says, after expiration of the representation period or any extension thereof, buyer enters into an agreement to acquire property described in paragraph 1A, which property broker introduced to buyer or for which broker acted on buyer's behalf. The obligation to pay compensation pursuant to this paragraph shall arise only if, prior to or within 3 calendar days of expiration of this agreement or extension thereof, broker gives buyer a written notice of those properties which broker introduced to buyer or for which broker acted on buyer's behalf. So, if I have that list that says, Whittier, Downey, whatever, or I have specific addresses, or I've shown them properties, right, that are in there, or even if it doesn't match the criteria in those areas, but I've written an offer and that offer got rejected or didn't get presented, if I give them a list of all the addresses that fall under those categories, within 3 calendar days of the expiration, if they, within that 6 months, go and write an offer on any of those properties and get it accepted, I am owed compensation. Okay? So, keep that in mind. Again, it's keeping track of everything that we've shown these people that were under this buyer representation agreement. Okay? Timing of compensation. Compensation is payable upon completion of any resulting transaction and if an escrow is used through escrow. If acquisition is prevented by default of buyer upon buyer's default. So, if I write an offer on one of the properties that falls into the category of this contract, well, any property, obviously, if I write an offer, and it cancels because the buyer acts in bad faith, right, removes all contingencies and then cancels, the buyer would still owe me compensation if they acted in bad faith and canceled the deal, right? So basically the same terms that would cause them to lose their deposit, they would have to pay me compensation as the buyer's agent. If acquisition is prevented by a party to the transaction other than the buyer, when buyer collects damages by suit, settlement, or otherwise, compensation shall be equal 1/2 of the damages recovered, not to exceed the compensation provided for in paragraph 3A, after first deducting the unreimbursed payments, credits, and expenses of collection, if any. So just like in the listing agreement, if the seller ends up getting suing the buyer because of breach of contract and they get the deposit or some other kind of monetary compensation, technically I am owed 50% of that or my entire compensation, whichever is less. And it's the same thing here. So let's say that the buyer fails to close escrow because the seller does something and they sue the seller for damages for whatever reason and they win those damages. Technically I would be due 50% of those damages they received up to my original commission amount. Okay. Buyer includes any person or entity other than the broker related to buyer or who in any manner acts on buyer's behalf to acquire property described in paragraph 1A. So that's more like if it's a corporation or, it's purchasing the property. Like, let's say, for example, it's my corporation. It's Estrada Incorporated, and I'm signing on behalf of it. Well, Estrada Incorporated and myself, are also the buyers, right? So it encompasses entities that have people signing on behalf of that entity. Questions about the compensation stuff so far that we've covered? Any questions? Because I know it gets a little jumbled, so I want to make sure you guys understand. No? Okay. Buyer has not previously entered into a representation agreement with another broker regarding property described in paragraph 1A unless specified as below, right? So what we're saying here is, if I'm working with a new buyer and I'm having signing that, I'm going to ask them, by the way, did you work with any other brokers and sign a buyer representation agreement where they had the rights to represent you? If they say no, then I'm going to put buyer states no in this little space right here. If they say yes, then I'm going to write the name of the other broker that may have a buyer representation agreement with them. Okay? Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put here, buyer warrants that buyer has no obligation to pay compensation to any other broker regarding property described in paragraph 1A unless buyer acquires the following properties. So they have that buyer representation agreement from before. The buyer representation agreement has expired. that last broker did what we talked about up here and put the 180 days, gave them the list of all the properties that they can't write an offer on without having to pay commission to the previous broker. They have to give me that list. And if they have it, I'm going to put see attached list in this space. If they don't have any list like that, then I'm going to put buyer states no. Right? So that means that the buyer is telling me that they have no previous obligation with any other brokers. That the broker hasn't given them an exception list that says if they write an offer or get their offer accepted on any of these listed properties, that they owe compensation to the previous broker. Okay, so that's the question that I'm asking people when I'm using this. This is going to talk about internet advertising and things like that, just like the listing does. This is what the buyer authorizes the broker to do, right? Locate and present selected properties to buyer, prevent offers authorized by buyer, and assist in qualification. Upon request, provide buyer with a list of professionals or vendors who perform services on the buyer's inspection advisory, order reports and schedule attend meetings and appointments with the professionals chosen by the buyer, provide guidance to help buyer with acquisition of property, obtain credit report of buyer, right? So this is just kind of stuff like our obligations to the buyer. This is the scope of duty. So what it's saying is, while I'm going to do those things, I'm authorized to do some things on your behalf. I recommend that you select all the professionals, that you schedule all the times, that you are the one who's responsible. I'm not going to be responsible for that as the broker. Trino, you're muted. Unmuted? Did you have a question? No, I guess not. It was an accident. All right. So as you look through here, it says, while broker will perform the duties described in paragraph 6B, broker recommends that buyers select other professionals as described in the attached buyer's inspection advisory to investigate the property through inspections, investigations, tests, surveys, reports, studies, and other. So it's basically saying, hey, listen, I can do that stuff, but you should. My recommendation is you do it. And that should be your recommendation to your buyers, is that they identify the people that they're going to hire to do the work. Now, I know that gets difficult, right? Buyers say, well, that's why I hired you to help me. Great. Here are 3 people, right? Here's 3 inspectors. Here's 3 termite companies. Here's 3. You choose which one. You make the phone call. You hire them. You schedule. Just let me know the dates and times that you schedule so I can be there and make sure that the sellers are available and all those things, right? You have to do that part of it. And then when they choose the people, right, also maybe follow up with emails. I know that it seems like it's getting a little bit like I'm trying to help you guys. I don't know how to explain it. I want you to cover yourselves better, because these little things that sometimes we feel like, oh, well, everybody does it, are ultimately the thing that comes back to get us, right? So if my buyer says to me, hey, I trust you, go hire, I just want you to schedule the home inspection. The first thing we do, because we all do it, every one of us do this, is we call our home inspection company, we schedule it, we tell them what time, we tell the buyer where to be, we tell the buyer to write a check, and then if there's an issue with that home inspection, who really hired the home inspector? Was it the buyer or was it me? It was me. And so now what happens is my liability jumps up again. So if I give my buyer 3 people, right, to hire, and I tell them, here are the 3 people that I would recommend, but you can Google anybody you want and hire anybody you want to do the home inspection. Please just let me know who you've hired and when we're scheduled so I can make sure everything is okay. And then after that phone call, I'm going to send an email that says, hey, this is just to follow up on the phone call that we had. I want to clarify. These 3 people I've recommended, but you have the right to choose anybody to, provide this service to you. Please just let me know who you've hired and when you've scheduled it so that I can make sure that everybody's available. Thank you so much. And please get back to me. Can you please respond to this email? Something like that. Because I don't ever want them to say that I hired, I did, because if anything goes wrong with that service provider, it's going to be my fault. And I don't want that to happen. So you guys got to protect yourselves. Buyer acknowledges and agrees that broker does not decide what price buyer should pay or seller should accept, does not guarantee the condition of the property, does not guarantee the performance, adequacy, or completeness of inspections, services, products, or repairs provided or made by seller or others, does not have an obligation to conduct an inspection of common areas or offsite areas of the property, shall not be responsible for identifying defects on the property of common areas or offsite unless such defects are visually observable by an inspection of a reasonably accessible areas of the property or are known to the broker, shall not be responsible for inspecting public records or permits concerning the title or use of the property, shall not be responsible for identifying the location of boundary lines or other items affecting title, shall not be responsible for verifying square footage, right? So this is a list of the stuff that we're not responsible for, and we've talked about this in classes in the past. When your buyers have questions about boundary lines, about permits, about that stuff, your direction should be, you need to go to the city of whatever, go to the building department, ask for copies of all the permits. Don't ask for specific permits, just say I need to see all the permits for this address. If you want to hire somebody about the property lines, the surveyor or somebody, you have the right to do that. That stuff has to go back on the buyer. Now, can you assist them once they've made the decision to do those things? Yes. Can you go with them to the city? Yes. Should you do it on your own? No. Because you ultimately become responsible for that information that's delivered. So if I go to the city of Downey, look at all the permits on a property, and I say to those buyers, hey, yeah, everything's permitted, but I misread the permits. Guess who's going to be responsible if something isn't permitted on the property? Me. So you're not doing that. You could drive them to the city and you could stand there while they ask the questions. Or if you trust your buyers, you could direct them to go to the city themselves. And again, those conversations are still followed up with an email. By the way, we discussed today about due diligence on the permits and the property itself. I advised you to go to the city. I'm available to go with you if you would like, but you need to talk directly to the city and the planning department and look for permits on your own. Like, you have to follow all that stuff up in emails, because your buyers will get amnesia and they will tell you, nobody told me that. So these emails are going to save you someday. So I know it sounds like a lot, but please start to add that into your business process of conversations about things like this, that there is always a follow-up email. Okay? This is the buyer obligations. It's basically just saying, hey, listen, buyer, you're going to act timely also. You're going to do the things we advise you to do. If properties come up that match this list, you're going to go see them as soon as you possibly can. You're not going to drag your feet. Right, is basically what they're saying. Like, hey, buyer, you're going to work too. It's not all on us. You got to be available to do the things you're supposed to do, that you're going to qualify. Now, this says right here, right after it says they're going to look at the property and all that stuff, it says buyer further agrees to act in good faith towards the completion of a property contract and the furtherance of this agreement. Within 5 calendar days from the execution of this agreement, buyer shall provide relevant personal financial information to broker to assure buyer's ability. So what they're saying is, I have an agreement with you that says, hey, I have to work on your behalf. But now what this is saying is that you got to prove to me that you can work. Now, that you can buy. Now, most of the time, we're not signing this until after they've already talked to a buyer, so we know they've already provided this information to us, because we know they've worked with our lender already. We know that they're qualified, what they're qualified for, so we'll have this in that 5 days. But if I'm working with a buyer, because you guys are working with buyers out there that started with somebody else or got qualified on their own, and they come to work with you, right? They move on and they say, well, this is my lender. Okay, great, I'm going to have you sign it, but you got 5 days to get me everything from your lender, right? Or else we're not going to work together. Now, some of this stuff is hard stances for you guys to take as buyer's agents, and I know most of the time we're not going to do that, right? Where we're going to be like, hey, you got 5 days to get me your financial information or we're not going to work together. I know most of us won't do that. But there's going to be a time in your career where you're going to have to do that, right? When you all become as successful as you want to be, you're not going to be able to take on every buyer. You're not going to wait on buyers who don't provide you with their financial information right away, and you're not going to have time for the buyers that are headaches, right? And I know that sometimes it's tough to do that at the beginning of your career when your production is not where you want it to be. But if we don't start running our business today the way we would run our business if we were top producing agents, it's going to be very difficult to make that transition into that kind of disciplined business where you don't let the people get in your way that shouldn't get in your way. Okay. Buyer agrees to indemnify, defend, and hold broker harmless from all claims, disputes, litigations, judgments, costs, attorney fees arising from the incorrect information supplied by buyer or from any material issues that buyer fails to disclose in writing to broker, and to pay for reports, inspections, and meetings arranged by broker on buyer's behalf. Buyer is advised to read all attached buyer's inspection advisory for a list of items that concern the typically warrant inspections or investigation by buyer or other professionals. The BIA, it's the same one that's attached to purchase agreements. Okay, that shows here that there's a buyer's inspection advisory that is attached to it. The attorney fees, everybody's responsible for their own attorney fees. The entire agreement is saying that all of our understandings between the parties are in this agreement. Anything outside this agreement doesn't matter. It's all got to be inside here. Okay. This says that we're going to go to mediation for any issue that we have. And if we want to go to arbitration after that, instead of litigation for a dispute between broker and buyer, we'd have to sign a separate form, the ARB form. That's an arbitration agreement. That's in zip forms also. Buyer signs, you sign as agent, and that's it. That's the buyer representation agreement. We're not going to go into the investigation advisory and those things, because it just talks about what they should be looking at, right? The condition of the property, the square footage and boundaries, wood destroying pests, soil stability. These are just some of the things that they can investigate during their investigation periods. And that's all this lists for them to look at. Okay. Now, I would suggest, and this one I saw, when I'm looking at it, this rental property restrictions, that's a great idea for people that are buying condos and single families and things like that, to turn into rental properties. Before you guys close escrow, those people should be making sure with the city that there is no restrictions on them being able to rent, or with the HOA that they're able to rent, because there's nothing worse than him buying this as an investment property and then it turns out I can't use it as an income property because they don't allow me to. So just remember those things when you're talking to somebody who's saying, well, I could use this as an investment. Okay. Do the due diligence, check with the city, check with the HOA departments, HOA companies, make sure that they can use those for rentals. So questions. It's quick. It's not a long form. We went through it pretty quick, but questions. Now, again, I don't think that this is something that you absolutely have to incorporate into your business. I think it is like I said, more of a moral contract than it is, a fiscal contract binding them to you, because it kind of makes them feel committed. I think it's an absolute necessity. If, like I was asked earlier, can I ask for more commission over what the commission is being paid? Or if my buyer is going to pay my commission solely, you have to have this form. There is no other form to cover those two things, so you have to use it for that. But if this is something you feel like you want to incorporate into your business, then you've got to do it the right way, which means you've got to tell people up front when you're meeting with them that in order for you guys to work together, they're going to sign some paperwork. And then you have to stick with it. If your business model is going to become, I want my buyers to sign buyer representation agreements, then you got to do it with everybody. You can't pick and choose. And that means you have to, if a buyer doesn't want to sign it, then you don't work with that buyer. And it's a difficult thing for most of us to do as buyer's agents in the position we're either new or not producing the way we want to. So that happens, right? Where it becomes difficult to say no to buyers. So any questions about the buyer representation agreement, about anything? No, you guys got it? Anybody planning on incorporating this into their business? Anybody using it now and from today realized you weren't using it correctly? No? All right. Well, if it is something that you feel like you want to incorporate in your business and you want to spend some more time, we could talk about it one-on-one if it's something you're on the fence about and you want to do it. But I want you guys to understand how this works, what the benefit is to you. I mean, it really is a benefit to you because, if you want to take it all the way, the buyers are locked in. They're ready to work with you. They have to work with you as long as you do what you're supposed to do. Okay. And yeah, right. If you've lost buyers in the past that you feel like you've worked hard for, it's probably something that you're going to want to incorporate or are open to incorporating. So he says, do other brokers truly enforce these on us? Well, here's the thing. They can't enforce. It's not enforced on us. It's like not enforced on other brokers. This is enforced on the buyer. And I think that's the misconception, is that people believe the use of this form creates kind of, if a buyer were to, let's say, okay, so a buyer has this signed with me and they go and write an offer with, another office somewhere, and they get that offer accepted. What buyers agents assume this means is that, oh, I'm their agent on that, you have to give me your commission, Mr. Buyer's agent. And that's not what it means. They can complete that deal, they can do whatever they want, and I have to go after the buyer to get the compensation I was owed, because the buyer and I have this agreement, not any other brokers and I have this agreement. So it doesn't force a broker to pay me, it forces a buyer to pay me. But generally what happens is if there's this agreement that's enforceable, this contract, and a buyer breaks it and I tell another broker about it, their fear is going to be that they're going to get sued in some way because somehow I have procuring cause for this contract. And that's not how it works. This contract doesn't create procuring cause. Only thing that does that is that I submit an offer to the property. So if I submit an offer to that property and then they went with another broker to buy it, that'd be different. Then the broker would owe me the commission. But if the buyer is just violating this contract, the broker owes me nothing. Neither broker, the listing broker nor the buying agent, the buyer's agent that represented them, they owe me nothing. The buyer owes me. The buyer owes me. So usually what that does is it kills the deal for the buyer's agent, because once I tell the buyer, hey, listen, you can close on this if you want, but I'm gonna take you to court for the compensation, buyers usually cancel, right? Or the seller or the buyer's agent and the listing agent don't want to be involved in that. Okay. How do you get the buyer? You have to take them to court, right? You have to go to mediation first, and then either litigation or arbitration. That's how you get them to pay. All right, guys. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you for being here. I hope this clarification on this forum gave you some clarity or gave you some extra knowledge about it, helped you decide whether for sure I'm not going to use it or maybe I want to incorporate it. So I hope that helped. I'm glad you guys were here. It's been 2 weeks or so, 3 weeks since I've been on, so I appreciate seeing you guys and appreciate you being here, and I will talk to you again soon. Thank you guys. Be safe.